Okay, well, happy to sit down with both of you again, fathers, and welcome everybody. It's on.
Nice.
It's live.
All right. Okay,
so,
good.
Welcome to Ask Your Father podcast. We have a front and part of a back here of questions that we're hoping to get to today, so we got to be on our game. And the first two questions here, I actually didn't put on the initial email sheet, so this is going to be a little bit of a shock because these are personal questions. So the first one here is for Father Burish. Is Father Burish dyeing his hair black? It seems much darker than it has been in times past. There's been some buzz about this.
These are the things that this is the kind of thing that people really want to know about. Not questions about celibacy.
No, ask your priest anything.
Is Father dyeing his hair? That's really what we want to know. Well, I'd like to let it be known that no, I am not coloring my hair. This is my natural color. I have let it grow a bit longer. It's very funny.
A bit longer?
I have let it grow a little bit longer.
Would you say that you've been inspired by anybody? I
have not been inspired by my associate in that regard.
All right, okay.
But there are definitely, if I grew a beard, it would definitely be gray, I think. But, so no, I just have dark hair, and now that it's longer, it just shows. So
fair enough.
Okay. After our last podcast, which you may recall, we discussed the possibility of you growing a beard during Lent. There was
that obviously didn't happen.
It did not happen.
There were multiple people at the following weekend.
There's been chat
like no beard.
You know what? I heard a lot of people saying the opposite. So, with Notre Dame starting its campaign soon, how much to you is growing your beard out worth?
My question would be, how much is it worth to the parishioners who would give?
Well, that's the question.
Who would pledge? So
yeah, if there's anybody out there who wants to make a conditional pledge, now is your time to do it.
We'll start bidding at $10,000 over the next 5 years. And Father Guenther, for you, if you were to shave clean on the head and the beard, $10,000.
$10 or so.
All right, fair enough.
I'm probably less able to be goaded into those sorts of things.
Well, clearly you're not.
The second one here is for Father Guenther, actually. So I haven't seen Father Guenther on his motorcycle yet this spring. When is he going to take it out?
Oh, that's a funny story and a funny thing that you should ask. Because we had this lovely weather this last week, and I got it out for the first time, and I got a flat tire.
Right.
So I was luckily I was at Quick Trip when it went flat, so I didn't. There was no danger on the road or anything. But luckily,
you got some free air there at Quick Trip. And
yeah, well, the valve stem was rotten, and so there was no fixing it at Quick Trip. So luckily, shout out to Tim Strader, came and got me with his trailer. So. We got her all ship shape.
You can always count on Tim.
Yeah, there's nothing like a midweek adventure.
Tim the Tool Man.
That's right.
Right on. Great. Okay. Well, primed as we are by those questions, maybe we can get to some less important questions here. Just kidding. We have a lot of great questions. I've broken these up into liturgical questions, moral questions, and questions on grieving. I figured we could start with some of the liturgical questions here. We might be able to work through these a bit more quickly, as some of them are definitely repeats, but that's not a bad thing.
For those of you who are just tuning in.
Right. That's right. Okay, so we've been talking about in this first phase of Eucharistic revival, personal awareness of Jesus' presence in the Eucharist. We've talked about in the past sort of cultivating a sense of reverence, personal, but also sort of parish reverence of the Eucharist and deepening that. This first question is, I've come to understand the reverence I owe Jesus when I receive him in the Eucharist, but I'm getting a little older. I'm not able to genuflect or kneel as well as I used to be able to. On occasion, I attend Mass and I'm not able to do this. I wish I could kneel as I used to. What should I do now?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I think relatively relatively easy. I think the church, just asks us to make some sign of reverence as we approach the Eucharist. Of course, God, He knows. He only expects us to do the possible, right? And so if it's not possible to kneel, that's okay. Make a sign of reverence that you can. Perhaps it's a bow, as profound as you might be able to, or even just a head bow. Of course, noting that it's our interior disposition that is most important. And I think that any parish that I've been to, even whether it's the Shrine and La Crosse, or any parish that traditionally receives perhaps even at a communion rail, they would never expect somebody to kneel that can't, right? That's not, the church has never in our history had that expectation. And so don't feel bad. Just continue to grow that interior disposition, to kneel in your heart, so to speak.
Right, and if you might be for some, I think there is a great desire to show that kind of reverence and to kneel. But if it would be at the point where you're not sure you'll be able to get back up, it would be best if you just stood and bowed or
try and avoid accidents in
right,
the communion
right.
line.
If Father has to put down the ciborium with the Blessed Sacrament to help you back up, that might be too far. So.
Yeah.
Great. Second question here. When the priest holds up the host and the chalice and says, "This is my body, this is my blood," during the prayer of consecration, are we supposed to bow our head or look up during that moment of worship? Is there preferred?
I don't know that the church is really saying that one must do one or the other. I mean, simply because it is sort of an exposition or a showing of the Blessed Sacrament, I certainly don't think it would be inappropriate to not look or that you had to bow, but I think really just to show a sign of reverence or adoration, whatever that is for you, that would be my sense on it. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen the church make anything explicit, right, as to what to do. I think a lot of people have kind of the beautiful tradition of saying the words that we heard St. Thomas speak this last weekend, right? "My Lord and my God," right? Acknowledging the true presence. But also just in a sense, like that's being, one of really the high point of the Mass, to just offer up our complete selves, right? And that, and however that kind of looks, posturally wise, of course, kneeling, as it were. So
Right.
Yeah, right on. Cruising today. When is Notre Dame going to commit to a full communion rail?
sounds like a question for the pastor.
Michael Tuta, if this is you again, every single time we sit down for one of these, Michael Tuta just copy and paste his question from last time.
Just trying to.
But jokes aside.
I mean, what I would say, so bearing in mind that the church not so long ago was just renovated and it's a tile floor, and it's kind of hard to change those kinds of things, and a communion rail would be very hard to just simply add on to that. If there's a number of people who are would like to see something like that happen, as pastor, whenever someone wants to see something move like that, what I like to see is a group of people get together, make a proposal, and consider funding, and bring that proposal to me, and it can be a discussion item. But at this point, it's kind of hard for me as the pastor to just start on a project like that, given that the church has been recently renovated, and we're talking about a number of other things with this campaign, which at least Notre Dame parishioners will hear more about. So if there's people that are serious about something like that, it works best to make a proposal and think about how this could actually be done.
Mm-hmm. Great.
That's how I would.
Great. All right. Can you add to that, or?
That sounds great.
The pastor has spoken. All right. Why do the churches, I think this is maybe speaking for all three churches in Our Lady of the Falls, Catholic community, but why do the churches have multiple hymnals? Can't we decide on one?
Just very indecisive.
We cannot decide on one. That's why we have two, in fact. Well, I think
actually three, because St. Bridget has a different
that's right.
renewable resource.
Well, I think especially speaking to Holy Ghost and Notre Dame, who have two hymnals, it speaks to the fact that there's...
Well, both of them do. So, clarification, I mean, Holy Ghost and Notre Dame, they both have the Blue Gather hymnals, but then Holy Ghost also has the Pew Missal, and Notre Dame this year has the Source and Summit, which are very similar.
Yeah, but they do differ in a particular degree because they gather from the two missals, because the missals have the readings that are updated each year with the date.
Right.
And so it's a little bit more convenient in that regard to have the order of the Mass with the music that we might be using just right there. So, it's not, we don't actually have two hymnals. We have a hymnal and a missal. Now, the missal actually includes some music. So,
right.
But it turns also to the fact that there are some hymns that one might not have that the other does have. So there's also that consideration.
Right, and maybe so. I'm not exactly sure what the person asking the question is, what they've observed and what they're asking about. But on the one hand, when we have three different parishes that we haven't really had together for all that long, it's hard to make a change and just impose when you have different staff and volunteers at each of those parishes used to doing things a certain way. It's hard to just impose a universal change on everybody all at once. My preference is to take a little bit more time. With Notre Dame using the Source and Summit this year, again being very similar to the Pew Missal that Holy Ghost uses, for us as priests, we're basically giving it time to see which resource we like better, and we hope to make a decision about that for next year, about which one would be the more uniform, and then perhaps consider that for St. Bridget as well. So that maybe that's what the person's asking about. I'm not really sure, but I would say I agree. I think it is. I would like to have some more continuity, but working with real people, it's kind of hard to impose that all at once.
One thing at a time.
One thing at a time.
Right on. Great. Okay. Final one here on liturgical questions. At a recent Max school mass, Father asked the non-Catholic or non-receiving children to remain in the pew to reduce the amount of shuffling and during the time of distribution of communion. I'm assuming that this was done during the distribution of the Eucharist to ensure only practicing children receive the Eucharist. As an observer, it felt like it caused more shuffling of children climbing over one another to go to communion, and it felt exclusionary to those remaining in the pew. As a Catholic school, shouldn't we be encouraging these students to provide a clear sign that they can't receive and still come up for a blessing?
Good question. So there's a little bit more to that story. I met personally with the teachers at Holy Ghost a couple months ago to talk about that issue. It wasn't so much the concern that non-Catholic students were receiving the Eucharist. It was more that rather there being a shuffling around or a bit of chaos in the pews, all that shuffling around and chaos was happening right up where the reception of Holy Communion was taking place. And it was making it very hard to be reverent. Kids were, near running into each other, and also it was because there's different from a few years ago, we have a significant percentage of non-Catholic students. So I, as the priest, is giving blessings to many. I was probably giving more blessings to students than actually distributing the Blessed Sacrament. So primarily it was to eliminate, firstly it was to eliminate just the confusion of the students coming forward. So I would rather have a little bit of chaos coming in and out of the pews than actually right up where kids would be receiving. Secondly, it's important. A lot of people don't realize this, but the blessing that's given kind of customarily these days that you give to small children or children who are not of age to receive Holy Communion or
adults
who are
crossing
not Catholic,
Yeah,
not Catholic, crossing their arms, or just don't feel well disposed to receive, crossing their arms. The blessing that's given, like there's really nothing in the church's liturgical norms that envisions that kind of a blessing. That is something that has kind of developed, evolved, I guess, over the last few decades, maybe,
Yes.
As a way of kind of just making it easier for people coming forward who would not be receiving Holy Communion. Back in the old days, when everyone came up and knelt down at a communion rail, it didn't require everyone coming up in a line in a nice, orderly way like we do today, which kind of forces everybody to come forward to receive Holy Communion. Before, it was a lot easier to be more, I think, discreet about not receiving Holy Communion when there was the communion rail. And now when you just have like two ministers in front distributing, then it makes it hard for you not to come forward to receive Holy Communion or to receive a blessing. So the blessing, and I don't even know if they do that in other countries. It might be just an American church thing. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But that's just been a way of handling that. Some would say it's a way of being more quote unquote welcoming to non-Catholics who would not be receiving. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's not something that's really envisioned in the liturgical norms of the church at all. My concern with then giving the blessing to so many of the students coming forward, not only was it very tedious and it took a lot longer, but I feel that that our school's mission is to evangelize and to increase in young people's hearts a desire for the sacraments and the truth of the Catholic faith. And when so many students were coming up to receive a blessing, it was sort of like, I think it kind of conveys this sense of like one is just as good as the other, that receiving a blessing or receiving the Eucharist are just would be one of two options. Yeah. And I want our non-Catholic students to have a desire to receive Jesus in the Eucharist and to be curious, to kind of long for, what are my other friends participating in, and I think this would be a more fruitful way, or this change of practice would be a more fruitful way of doing that.
Yeah,
that's my opinion.
That's very well put.
Yeah.
And I think maybe to speak a little bit to the question of it being kind of exclusionary, like where we exclude kids, right?
Yeah, right.
But in the sense of perhaps we could look at it a little bit less like that, a little bit more like it's more of an invitation now, right? An invitation to explore what it does mean to become Catholic, what it does mean to be well disposed to receive the Eucharist. Both for Catholics and non-Catholics, right? To be well disposed to receive the Eucharist. So, so maybe just to kind of flip that on its head a little bit to say maybe there's not an exclusion, but rather an invitation.
There's the invitation to come into the church and to receive her sacraments. That invitation is.
And does that mean it's hard? Like sometimes, sometimes invitations can be a challenge, a challenge to meet. So.
And I would just say that in working with people in OCIA and talking about this topic, of people who aren't Catholic who maybe come to Mass a couple times, or maybe for a long time this past year, we had a lady who was coming to Mass for almost a year, and she's like, I've wanted to receive communion like this entire time, and I feel excluded from being able to do that because I learned, well, since I'm not Catholic, I'm not suited or disposed or prepared to receive the Eucharist. And the way that you explain that, it's a kind of pedagogy or a teaching tool of the Church, of Christ, I think, like you said, Father Guenther, and an invitation to see a beauty in front of us that we're not able to partake in. So we talk about this with our OCIA class, and I got to say, like that clicks for them. They're able to see, like, okay, this is not a line being drawn in the sand for the sake of exclusiveness, but rather for authentic inclusivity, right? It has to be authentic, though, and so there's an authentic invitation there to start with. So I've seen that in adults that have come to me and talked about that, who are not Catholic, yeah, they've received it really well and seen sort of that as it is. So,
Totally.
yeah, great.
Good question.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Switching to moral questions.
Oh yeah.
All right. My husband is Lutheran. Not my husband.
One of them Lutherans. That's what we called them in Independence, I guess.
Most of Wisconsin.
My husband is Lutheran. He has told me and our children that he wants to be cremated when he dies. The land has been in this family, the farmland that we live on has been in this family for generations. Our adult children are confirmed Catholics. The problem is that he wants his ashes spread on our property when he's cremated. How do we deal with this?
Well, just to speak, like obviously he's Lutheran, so he's not, kind of bound by the laws of the church in that regard. But the church does allow cremation. It's not the preferred, way. The preferred way would be, inhumation, that is being buried in a casket. But cremation is certainly allowed. But the church still asks that, the cremains, what's left, the ashes, be buried, in a cemetery or in some place, intact, right? And so, there was nothing wrong with, getting cremated in that regard. Or certainly it would be allowed. But spreading it over the land it's always a little strange. I just want it spread over, and that's not always the best thing for perhaps those who mourn and are left behind, because there's this general locale of where the ashes have been spread. But I think I know even with my own family, like my grandma going to visit my grandpa's grave very often. She lived within walking distance of the cemetery, and to go visit him, his earthly remains each day, was something that was very consoling to her. And so having that sort of place, and it could even be, on the farm, perhaps there's a way to have kind of a permanent burial spot, and maybe, in a bit of a cheeky note, just because it's somebody's last wish doesn't mean it has to be done. Their last wishes, as it were, not demands.
But there is something, though, too, and I think these are things that we just don't always think about for ourselves. But I think, as Father Guenther said, that like for my grandparents, for instance, I know that there's a place that I can go to visit to offer prayers. Now, perhaps that could be done, still on this farm. However, a cemetery has there's much more of a perpetual ability to do that. This may be a piece of land that's in the family for a long time, and maybe in the family for a long time going forward. But it doesn't take much for a generation, for land to change hands, and you have no idea what can happen. It's I've said this to people where, you have no idea. I mean, the land could be bought, and they'll place a latrine right on top of wherever you had the ashes buried.
Yeah.
I mean, just consider that. There's no control over the preserving the dignity of those human remains going forward. If you do it, if the burial takes place outside of the cemetery. Cemetery, again, it's blessed ground, and it's chances are nothing else is really going to happen to that land. You really just don't have that certainty, even if it's a piece of land that's been in the family for generations. That can change.
Can a Catholic, so you said Lutheran or a non-Catholic is not bound by the same sort of expectations or rules? What are the different expectations?
Well, yes and no. I mean, perhaps I misspoke a little bit, because we're all bound to, respect the dead, right? To bury the dead, right? It's part of, just the gospel. I'm assuming he's baptized, right? So just as our, kind of our, just obligations by our being Christian, I think we have to dignify those who have passed and dignify even their earthly remains. So I think maybe I'd walk that back a little bit. Say I'm kind of all bound by that.
On the other hand, I mean, it's we as priests or the church, I mean, ultimately, we can't control what a person decides to do or what a family decides to do. But then that family has to live with the consequences of whatever comes of those, those remains. The church offers, her wisdom on how to respectfully care for the remains of, of our body, and we can heed that or not. And, so I mean, I think back to the person's question, which is a good one. I think just to invite your husband to consider these other factors. That of basically, I think there's two, like the lack of certainty there is in preserving a reverent place when the remains are not spread or are not buried in a cemetery, but then also having a place. People who die or are about to die are not always thinking about all their loved ones and their loved ones need to have that consolation of a place to go to them, or where their remains are, to pray for them and to mourn. It's sort of like some people would prefer not to have a funeral, to not have really any, for whatever reason, and I think there's maybe a bit of a mistaken notion of not wanting all the attention, but we do want those prayers of people
and the consolation
and the consolation of family. So don't, when you're considering these things, think about your family. Think about your family.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well said. Okay, why don't we finish with these? I hit these on the back. These there's questions. A couple questions on grieving. This comes in from a Notre Dame parishioner. She said, "Some comments have been made to me since my husband passed that have been in my mind and my heart. The first comment that I hear frequently is that there is no sadness in heaven, only happiness. So that when he looks down on you and you are crying, he doesn't see it. So why are you wasting your time being sad?" That was thing number one that she's been hearing. Thing number two is, you are no longer married. Till death do us part. So when you see him in heaven, he might not know you.
I think there's
can we agree that those are some pretty terrible things?
Who are your friends? Like, who's telling you these things? Oh my goodness.
Start by saying that those are not wise words of advice.
Yeah, if you have a friend who is grieving, don't tell him those things. Because I think both of them have perhaps a true premise. They don't have true conclusions.
Right.
Because it's true.
Kernels of truth there, but it's not. Right.
Yeah, because it is true that in heaven, it's eternal blessedness, right? It is eternal happiness. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't understand what sadness is, right? Yeah. He's God. He created emotions, right? He knows exactly what they are in the most perfect of ways. And he knows the sadness of, right, his only begotten Son being sent to earth, to die for our sins, right? It's absurd to think that God can't relate to the human experience. He's our creator, after all.
Right, who gave us this. I mean, and I've heard people offer, I think they're probably trying to be consoling by saying, you shouldn't be sad about this, or that you shouldn't grieve about this. Number one, we don't say that we don't make the claim that people are in heaven, right? Right off the bat, we pray for their eternal rest. We pray that they, may experience heavenly joy, that their souls may be purified. This is why we have a funeral mass to pray for the repose of their soul. We really don't make any presumptions one way or the other about them. But this idea that, we shouldn't grieve at all, it's God built into us this capacity to grieve, to mourn, to weep, and that is a healthy thing to do. That's part of. Remember the beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn. That's a beatitude, and that's because, we're anticipating something in eternity that we do not have right now. And so to have that sense of that things are not totally right in the way they should be in our current state is a good thing to have. So if you're mourning, that's okay. Like that's a good and healthy thing, and you should keep mourning. And you know that the strength of those feelings may fade over time, but they may not totally go away. And that's a capacity that God built into us, and it's a good thing. And always keeping in mind the hope for eternity that we have with the Lord. So
grieving is, I think that's a good point. Grieving is not mutually exclusive of hope, of a lively hope in the resurrection.
Yeah.
I mean, think of just a few weeks ago during Lent, we had the gospel of the raising of Lazarus from the dead, where Jesus, knowing all that he's going to do, he knows that Lazarus is going to die. He goes and he encounters, in the midst of their grieving and their tears, Mary and Martha, who are pouring out their heart. And Lord, if you were here, he would not have died. You can hear the distraughtness in what they're saying. And then Jesus himself, after telling his apostles, this has happened so that you might believe. Basically, I'm going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and it's going to be a great sign of my power, of my love, of my sovereignty over death. Jesus, knowing that he's going to do that, he still approaches the tomb, and with a kind of heavy spirit, he says, "Where have you laid him?" And he goes to the tomb, and it's the shortest little verse in the whole Bible. John chapter 9, verse 35. Jesus wept. Period. Jesus wept. You can hear John just witnessing that, the evangelist, the gospel writer, witnessing that, and just sort of, Christ broke down and grieved. He had a heavy heart, knowing that in a few moments, even that he would raise Lazarus from the dead. But there was still
who had total control over the whole situation.
Right. Right.
So if our Lord does that in the scriptures, I think you can too.
You can cry, I suppose.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think like the church offers through, even beginning with the sacrament, the sacrament of anointing, commendation of a dying purse for the dead, to the vigil, to the funeral, to the burial and beyond, offers a ritual of grieving, which is just so important, because I think that responds something so deep in the human person that God created, of course, that there is that need to grieve, and a need to grieve in community, in family, right, and in a ritualistic way that points to hope and worshiping our Lord.
Yeah, right. A great little book on this is by C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed. He wrote this after the passing of his wife, and it's a wonderful short little book on just how to grieve well. There's probably an art to it. The second point here was, you're no longer married till death do us part, so when you meet him in heaven, he might not know you. I guess I don't really know what this has to do with grieving, but maybe more just like on the nature of marriage after death.
Yeah.
Marriage is, an earthly institution, that the bond of it obviously doesn't continue, ceases at the time of death. But I would not make presumptions about what heaven and eternity are like, in the sense that you wouldn't know. I really don't. None of us really know exactly what heaven is like, but
I can't imagine you just forget everything.
Right. If you think you're going to get to heaven and be disappointed, I think
you're doing it wrong.
You might be somewhere else.
This is a little hotter here. Right. It's a brief thought on that too that I had when I read that, is that heaven is the enlivening and the perfect beatitude or blessing of all of God's creation. That it's the perfection and the restoration sort of the taking away of all the blinders that we have in our time here on earth. And so might it be more reasonable to say that when you meet your spouse or even a good friend in heaven, if they're there, you're there, you'll know them even more. There'll be an enrichment and an enlivening in that relationship because your bond is not dealing with limitations.
Right.
It's now caught up fully in the divine life of God, who reveals all things. He reveals himself to us, but also us to ourselves, us to each other.
Right. Yeah. You may know your husband better. And love more deeply.
Certainly that. Good.
Cool. All right. Another one on grieving. This one's a little bit different, I suppose, style-wise. This question clearly came in, or I imagine came in during Lent. Can you explain the station Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem, and why does he tell them to weep for their children?
You want to start?
A couple things I could say. Maybe just a couple points that kind of came to mind. First, I think it's noteworthy that the Lord is about to undergo his own passion. So he's suffering right in that moment, but then he is thinking about the consolation of these women. So he is looking outside of himself in that moment.
Another good lesson.
So I think that's very revelatory right there. Secondly, there's a reference like this. The Lord's referring to sometime in the future. I mean, it's a bit of a prophetic statement in which he's referring to the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which would happen in the year 70 A.D. when the Romans conquered. So this is decades after the Lord's death and resurrection. And, there was a great loss of life at that time. So that is what the Lord is referring to when he's saying, grieve not for me, but weep for your children. There is, and maybe you'll have more to say about this, there's really an excellent podcast that I came across on this particular question, on this statement, or with that station of the cross. It's an Ascension Press podcast with Dr. Edwards Sri. So if you just Google "Do Not Weep for Me," Ascension Press, you'll come up, and he explains it in much greater detail.
Yeah. I don't know why we would even continue. I'm sure he does a great job.
Yeah.
But,
so I highly recommend it. It was really very good.
Yeah. What I had read in preparation for this question was Pope Benedict's, the late Pope Benedict XVI's meditations at the Station of the Cross when they would give them at the Colosseum. They had these kind of stations that went around the Colosseum with Pope Benedict back when he was Pope. And the reflection that he offered to this station was that, like, when our Lord says, weep not for me, but for yourselves and for your children, he's pointing right to the seriousness of sin, of judgment, and of evil, right? That even worse than his suffering and his passion, right, is us not having a response to it, right? And so Pope Benedict says it's a call to true repentance and to call others to repentance. And it removes us from a sentimental piety. That it's a piety that's not just feelings, but rather moves us to a change of heart. And so I thought that was kind of a beautiful reflection, that it's like this weeping for our Lord is good, but it's not good if that's the only thing that we do. There has to be a movement to the heart that towards holiness and away from sin. So that was Pope Benedict XVI's response.
There's a lot of levels to that particular station.
Wow.
That's great.
That's wonderful. Little shout out to Ascension Press podcast. So when you're done listening to all of our podcasts here at Our Lady of the Falls, feel free to make your way over to
if you have time.
If you have time.
We do produce a lot of content, so we keep you pretty busy, but
Oh my.
We just want to give Father Mike Schmitz a run for his money.
yeah, I know.
We're not there yet, but
We are a little bit further south, though, so he's still got ice on the water.
it does. It's all coming here in Chippewa Falls.
Yeah, right. I want to close with this one. This one came in a while ago, and we haven't talked about it. The main reason that we haven't talked about it is because I think in our previous podcast we didn't really have time.
Right.
I think we have a little time today to get into it. And it's maybe...
the question goes back to, I think, November or in the fall. So it's been a while, and it was not our intention to not say anything about it.
Yeah.
But,
Nevertheless.
right. Read the question.
Yeah, I have the long form question here and the short form. Sort of like broke it down. I'll just do the long form. So how is it? So this question, just to kind of frame it, this question is about should the church reveal the names of priests or bishops and sort of publicize that and disseminate that information to the public when that priest or that person or figure is no longer a threat if they've committed a crime of some sort, so sexual, financial abuse or something like that, particularly sexual abuse. So the question here with that sort of in mind is, how is it that the ecclesial authority in the Diocese of La Crosse saw fit to release all the names of priests who had a credible sex abuse allegation against them? Is this supposed to compensate in some way for mistakes made in the initial handling of the incidents? How is it not a textbook case of detraction? See Catechism, paragraphs 2477. Excuse me. Every man is guilty of many sins, and the corporate effects vary with the sin and the circumstances, and in the end, all will be revealed. But how can one particular sin be singled out and made public, both regardless of and without revelation of their circumstances? Consider the case of a senior priest who long ago repented and as much as possible sought a just end for the victim. Then, at the sunset of his life, his sin is announced to the world. What objectively valid reason exists for this to be revealed to the 99% of people who have no need or right to the information? A very well thought out.
It's a very thoughtful question, yeah. I mean, I can't speak, and I'm not sure if that person was giving a hypothetical example with the priest with the sunset of his life, or if that's a real situation that person knows of. I'm not really sure. So it's kind of hard to comment on something exactly like that, a specific case that we don't really know that many more of the details. I think maybe a good place to start with that question, and I do feel like I can't answer it quite as fully as I'd like to. Neither of us were on the diocesan end of things in that whole decision-making process. We as priests were notified and I think reasonably informed before the release of names of clergy who had credible accusations against them of sexual abuse. And there was information shared of that, but I don't recall like exactly what. And that whole process of bringing about that whole revelation of names, I feel a little limited in how well I could explain it. But maybe a good starting point would be that question about detraction. Is this not a textbook example of detraction? And Father Guenther had a very nicely prepared response to that. I mean, I think short answer is I don't think it would be. I don't think we would say that it is a textbook case of detraction exactly. I mean, I think it's because in these kind of cases of sexual abuse, I think there's a lot of other variables that kind of qualify it. So I'll let you explain.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think what Father Burish is getting at is that it's hard, right? These things, we're all. I mean, hopefully we don't have to worry about this again, but we're dealing with humans on both ends, both in these priests and in the diocese and in all of these things. And so it could be the case that some things weren't done correctly, and some things could be improved. That's probably certainly the case in almost everything. Mm-hmm. So nevertheless, I think what we need to look at is just what is a definition for the sin of detraction, right? And so it's an unjust damaging of somebody's good name by telling something that is truthful or what we honestly believe to be the truth, right? And so I think two key words there are unjust, right, and damaging, right? And so there could be mitigating factors whereby what happened wasn't necessarily, detraction or didn't fit, very, closely with the definition, right? And so some questions that we could ask is there damage in not telling, right? Of course, I think we've probably all heard, right, the good of the healing process for both the diocese and the victims and even their abusers, right? There needs to be this healing process, and it seems that the diocese has saw fit to that kind of this revelation of names is a step in that healing process of healing the damage that has been done.
Right, because for many abuse victims, in the case of many of them, they were sworn to, or they were told not to to say anything, and so for them to have this hidden in their lives for many of them many years, there is something about making public, to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, that seems to be appropriate as a way of undoing the injustice that was done to them, in which they felt pressured to be silent.
Yeah, and the second factor to look at is priests are public figures, right? And so we're not like public like a politician or anything like that, but we're not not public, right? We're not just somebody in the pews, and so there is a greater degree to which like even sins that priests that commit that might be considered more private are not as much so as perhaps if somebody else were to have committed them.
Especially if we're talking something of a criminal nature.
Exactly, yeah. And then the final thing to consider is if the person is already notoriously a criminal, right? Now, that's not always the case, it certainly isn't, but that also gives reference to the fact that these names would almost certainly have been, if they weren't already, revealed by some other news outlet. And so I think our diocese and these dioceses, obviously I wouldn't speak in their name necessarily, but in a certain regard, like us trying to keep the name, trying to give some dignity to all parties involved, rather than just letting the news create their own narrative, right? Just without, as we see sometimes, without regard for the facts. And so to try and keep the story, right, to within our control, if that makes sense, to try and keep the truth the first thing at hand, right, so that we can begin that healing process for all involved.
Right, and I don't. There's probably more to this, but it's important to remember that our diocese release of names followed the Pennsylvania grand jury release of names. So again, that was not really done. That was out of the Diocese of Pennsylvania's control, Yeah. And so, again, I think there is something to a sort of a respectful, kind of preservation of dignity, or being able to control that to some extent, I think was, in trying to get ahead of a situation like that, I think was probably part of the intentionality of the diocese. I'm sure there are other factors as well.
So, none of this to, for it to be the final word on what was done right or wrong or anything, but maybe there's just always so much more to the story than any of us are considering, and any of us really could consider, because we're dealing with people, and there's just, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And I think we do live, we're living in a time, the revelation of these sexual abuse cases, if you look at the church's whole history, this hasn't been an issue that's been seriously dealt with. It's only been really more seriously dealt with for the last couple decades. Mm-hmm. And so I think we still, as the church have to wrestle with and figure out, what's the most just solution certainly for victims who've been, wronged, but also for priests who are accused too. Because there certainly have been cases in which priests have been wrongly accused. That doesn't mean that there aren't other more serious offenders that have been out there. But to what is the most just way to handle these kinds of things, and we may not be quite there yet. Yeah, but we keep praying.
Yeah,
keep working on all that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for
any other nice light questions you'd
like
to ask?
I feel like I should have saved one for the end.
Like what's your favorite color?
Leave on a lighter note here. But I don't have one.
That's good. Well, that's all, folks.
Perhaps just to end on this then, we're recording this in the Easter season, and the Easter season always reminds us that Jesus' victory has the final word. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of that's how the story goes. Jesus always wins.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so I think we were talking about a couple pretty deep and difficult things. Certainly this last topic here about abuse and prudential ways forward with that, but also the one on the questions on grieving, the question on the distribution of the ashes. A lot of these things are talking about either spiritual difficulty or death or physical death. And here we are in the Easter season, in which we can proclaim, like St. John Paul the Great did before us, that we are an Easter people, mm-hmm. and Alleluia is our song. And Jesus always wins, and he always has the final word. That's just a great vision of hope.
Right.
Yeah. Not just for this podcast, but just as a Christian, we just live different. Yeah. With that in our mind.
With all the things, all the problems in the church and the world, we're still people of hope.
Absolutely.
And, we should be joyful.
That's a great way to end.
Right on.
I'm happy with that one.
Everybody, thanks for your time. Hope you're as happy as we are. We'll see you around.
All right, take care.